What is the right amount of preliminary data to include in your R01? That is what we are talking about today. If you're new around here, my name is Sarah Dobson. I am a research grant consultant, and my team and I help early career researchers get funded at NIH. So, how much preliminary data? What's the right amount to include in your R01? That is the million-dollar question, or I guess the multi-million-dollar question when it comes to R01 grants. And the real answer is it depends. And I know that's not very helpful, but let me talk about a little bit what it actually depends on. And then let's talk about how and where to use preliminary data, which might help you figure out what the right amount is for the type of application that you are submitting. So the right amount of preliminary data depends on lots of different factors, some of which are your career stage. So when it comes to R01 grants in particular, early stage investigators are not required to include as much preliminary data as PIs who are further along in their careers. This is up for debate, I think, but according to NIH regulations, that is a factor that reviewers should consider when assessing the ESI applications. Another factor that contributes to how much preliminary data you would need would be the type of application that you are submitting, the type of research that you are actually doing, and what is required to establish the scientific premise of the work that you're doing. And this might look a little bit different, for example, if we're talking about hypothesis-driven proposals versus non-hypothesis-driven proposals, or say tool development proposals, as I've been calling them. So there are just two examples of different factors that will influence how much preliminary data you do need to include in your R01. And so let's talk a little bit about where preliminary data actually goes and what it is used for, right? So we've talked about this before. If you've watched any of my other videos on preliminary data, there are two main purposes for preliminary data. One is to establish really the scientific premise of the research that you are proposing to do. And so that's really about establishing, if you are doing a hypothesis-driven proposal, that's really about establishing how you arrived at your overarching or central hypothesis and how you developed each of your specific aims, which will ultimately test your overarching or central hypothesis, right? So you need enough preliminary data to build an argument for how you arrived at your central hypothesis and how you developed each of your specific aims. The other purpose for preliminary data is to establish feasibility. And that's really more on the kind of technical side of things, right? So it's really about arguing to your reviewers that you have the expertise and the experience with a particular technique or tool or type of analysis that you can do the work as you've proposed to do it. So it's really just about showing them that, listen, we know what we're doing. We've done it before. We have experience doing this. So those two sort of main purposes for preliminary data reinforce each other within the application to help you build that overall argument. And so it's really important when you're thinking about, especially the first one, I think, when we're talking about establishing the scientific premise of the research that you're proposing, is what's the argument that you need to make to sort of defend how you arrived at your central hypothesis or your main objective, right? And so that's going to include preliminary data. It should also include published literature, published peer-reviewed papers, and it should really be a sort of analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of what's already out there as you're building that overall argument for how you arrived at your central hypothesis or your main objective. And so that's going to look a little bit different depending on your specific application. But the idea there is that you are really building that argument for why this work needs to be done in the first place and why you're on kind of solid scientific ground. And one thing I can say as somebody who has been consulting on these types of grants for a very long time is that sometimes you can get into a situation where too much of your scientific premise is based on preliminary unpublished data. And what that ends up doing is undermining your argument because not enough has been established already. And so you end up creating a lot of skepticism among your reviewers because if too much of the work that you're using to argue for the development of your central hypothesis is not well established, everything kind of feels like it's on shaky ground. And so that's why it's really important as you are developing that argument for the scientific premise of what you're doing, the overarching hypothesis or the main objective of what you're doing, is that there is a balance of preliminary work that you and your team have done, but that's also embedded in what is well established in the literature. So you are showing that, look, we're on solid ground here and we're sort of moving in a direction that's leading us to this overarching hypothesis, which we're going to test through these specific aims, right? So it's not completely sort of unfounded or unestablished. And in my view, that's sort of the difference between an R01 style project versus something that's a bit more high risk, high reward that you would see in a different grant mechanism. But typically with an R01, you want to be building on existing work in a way that does advance the field in an innovative way, but that allows you to argue that we can definitely do this. Whereas in a high risk, high reward situation, there's a chance that it might all fall apart, right? And typically with R01s, that's not how you are framing your argument. So again, the amount of preliminary data that you need to establish the scientific premise of your application and the feasibility of your application is highly dependent on your individual project and what you're proposing to do. But the sort of categories that we're looking at in terms of the work that you need to do to establish either of those things will tell you a little bit about what you need to do. And again, when it comes to establishing the scientific premise, you're really sort of synthesizing the strengths and weaknesses of what's already out there in the literature and your own preliminary work to land on a central hypothesis or a main objective. And then when it comes to the feasibility side, that is really about demonstrating that you have the technical expertise and experience to be able to carry out the experiments that you're proposing to do, or the steps in the development of a tool that you are proposing to do, right? So hopefully that helps you figure out what it is that you need to focus on as you are preparing to write an R01 grant, and what sort of preliminary data you need to help you write a clear and persuasive and competitive application. So if you found this helpful, I strongly encourage you to sign up for our resource library. It's completely free. And inside our resource library are lots of tutorials and worksheets and videos to help you write a stronger NIH application.